We're in record.
Hi, everyone. I'm David Zinner. Tell you a little bit about myself, but I want to say welcome to everyone. It's really great to be the guest of the Natural History Society of Maryland, my first time. Um, I've been involved in cemetery work. I guess it goes back to when I was 13, and my mother told me to get a summer job at no pay working in our local cemetery. And I spent the summer pulling weeds out of ivy growing on graves, which doesn't is no longer the standard in cemeteries, but back in those days it was pretty standard. Um, so didn't really get involved in cemeteries again um, until my congregation in Columbia, Maryland, was approached by a cemetery saying, "Wouldn't you like to buy a section or have a section?" And I volunteered to explore it and to look at their proposal. And it's sort of been uphill ever since. I got involved in managing a cemetery section at Mount Lebanon Cemetery in Adelphi. Um, and I got onto the Advisory Council for Cemetery Operations for the state of Maryland. I've been doing that for about 12 years. And then I started a program called PRINCE, which stands for Preservation and Rehabilitation Initiative for Neglected Cemetery Entities, um, which is an interesting program. We have a memorandum of understanding with the Department of Corrections to bring out prison work crews to work in cemeteries around the state. And I recently started chairing a committee to propose new legislation for cemeteries in the state of Maryland. We have 6 bills that we're going to be trying to get through this particular legislative session. So that's a little bit about me. There's probably more, but that's more than enough. Um, but I want to say that about cemeteries, that cemeteries are really interesting from so many different perspectives. There's um, there's the ceremonial parts that happen at a cemetery when someone dies and they're buried, which are interesting all by themselves. Um, in different traditions, people fill in the grave themselves, or have the cemetery workers do it, and it becomes a very hands-on, um, emotional, cathartic type of process, and that's a um, very interesting thing that happens at the time when someone dies, that there's an opportunity for people to do something physical and you know begin to process the grief that they're going to feel. Um, but cemeteries are also a place for the living because they have so much historical value. Um, they have interesting uh, native species or invasive species, which are fun to try and identify. And if you're working at a cemetery, to try and get rid of the invasive species is always a challenge. They have history written into the tombstones. And it's interesting when you think about doing genealogy or doing family records. When my mother did an interview for the Holocaust project, the Shoah project, um, her original interview was on tape. And after a while, we realized we were not going to be able to play that tape anymore. So we put it onto a CD. And then after a while, we realized we weren't going to be able to play that CD for very long. So we put it up on YouTube. Um, so now, it's available for anyone to look at. And I realize also is that cemetery records, the engravings on monuments in cemeteries, are a very permanent type of record. They they don't go out of date very easily. They may be in a language that you no longer understand. My mother and I went to Germany in the year 2000 and we visited 13 cemeteries. She would hold the umbrella over my head because it was snowing, and I would be sitting there with my computer typing information in. And we had some interesting experiences. Um, we went to a town hall in a town called Lumsheim, and we got there at 11 and they welcomed us and they said, come on in. They opened up the safe. They said, here, go take a look at this record book. And we sat there and it was all in German script. Unfortunately, my mother could read German script. She was probably one of the last classes to learn it. Um, and I'm transcribing and it's 12 o'clock and they said, we're all going home, but you can stay. There'll be one person here. And when we were finished, we said to the one person, we'd like copies of all of this. And he made copies for us. And he was like this engineer. He folded everything nicely and stapled it and put it in a binder for us. So it was really a great experience. That didn't happen in every community, but that one was pretty good. Another one, we went to look for the Jewish cemetery in a town that was right on the Mosel River. And we couldn't find the Jewish cemetery. We found the Christian cemetery and we couldn't find the Jewish cemetery anywhere. So we stopped in at the first store next to the Christian cemetery. It was a wine store. And my mother recognized one of the brands that was on the wine bottle. It translates as naked behind. And the reason that they used that brand is because the the grapes were on the hillside and the women who were picking the grapes didn't wear underwear. So when you looked up the hill, you could see their naked behind. Um, so she had a conversation with him all about that. And it turned out that he knew her grandmother and got cookies from her. And he took us to see the Jewish cemetery, which was like we had to wind our way through the vineyards up to the hill where he told us where the cemetery was. So cemetery exploration creates interesting stories. And if you are willing to put yourself out and talk to people, you can learn quite a lot. There's an interesting um, there's an interesting dichotomy between the Baltimore and the Washington area with how many of the cemeteries are organized. In the Baltimore area, many of the cemeteries are structured as nonprofits. They're either religious cemeteries or cemeteries that are structured as an independent nonprofit. Whereas in the Washington area, many more of the cemeteries are um, for-profit, commercially owned cemeteries. And you'd think that, 50 miles up and down the road, you would not see that, but that's the situation that I've observed. It's also interesting that there is a whole new kind of cemetery that's just getting started, green or natural cemeteries. In the Baltimore area, there's one, um, I'll think of the name in a second. Anyone know the name? Um, it's in Western Baltimore County and it's Serenity Ridge.
Yeah.
And it's like acres and acres of forests and meadows, and they don't allow any, you can't be embalmed, you can't, um, um, you need to have simple caskets or no caskets to be buried there. They don't allow upright granite stones. They use river stones that are flat. It's a really beautiful place. And there's one starting in Silver Spring also called Renaissance Park. So this is the newest trend, I think, these all natural sort of woodland type cemeteries. So I'm going to pause for a second and see if people have questions about anything I've said so far. And you can wave your hand okay. Kim says yes to green burial. Okay, Kim, where's Kim? Kim, can you unmute yourself? Oh, there's Kim.
Sure.
What do you mean yes to green burial, Kim? Tell us.
I'm just glad it got a little mention here. I know it can be challenging as we love to look at old grave markers, but I think the green and natural way to be buried can also preserve some of that information, as well as helping the body decompose more quickly and leave the next generation a little better earth to play with.
I'd say that was well put. Kim, what I've been advocating in green cemeteries is that people put a little brass marker on the river stone that would have a QR code on it. And then you can link it to a website and you can put as much information on there as you want. You can put in pictures, you can put in ethical wills, you can put in stories, you can put in family trees, whatever you want. And instead of putting it on a big giant piece of granite that comes from Georgia or Canada and costs a lot of money, you can do it for almost nothing. So I don't think we should lose the history and the genealogy and the ability to do research. I just think we need to figure out a better way to do that.
I
And
agree. And you're right, we're right there, right? With technology changing so quickly, it makes sense to get ahead of the game there.
yeah, yeah, exactly right. Um, so and there are regular cemeteries that are starting to do green sections too. Some of those are not successful and some of them are. So, it's definitely a trend. The other question that it raises is this going to address the issue of cremation? For many people, cremation is the antithesis of cemeteries. If someone is cremated, their remains are given to the family, and then the family has a choice of what they're going to do with it. They can keep it, like on the shelf, they can scatter it somewhere, or they can possibly bury it in some cemeteries. But if they choose the first two, there's no historical record of what happened to that person. And often the cremated remains, if they're given to someone, to put on a shelf in their house, a couple of generations later, it falls off the shelf and it gets vacuumed up, um, that kind of thing. And when people scatter those cremated remains, that's not good for the environment because they're they're I think it's too acidic, and they don't help plants grow. They're really bad for uh, for plants. So that's a little bit. Um, I'm going to tell you about Prince, unless you have more questions about green cemeteries and what's happening with cemeteries. If you do, shout it out or well, whatever. No? Okay, good. So Prince is a program that works with a memorandum of understanding with the Department of Corrections. And what we're doing with this program is we're doing some training in the prison for prisoners who are going to be getting out of prison in the next year or two. And then we're bringing them out to cemeteries to do work at cemeteries. And then we're working with them on placement when they get out. So it's a three-part program. And the part with the education in the prison is a challenge. It's always a challenge dealing with the prison bureaucracy. We have one $25,000 grant a couple years ago, but we haven't been able to get that renewed, but we're working on it. And basically, we did a 12-week training of everything that you would want to know about cemetery care, care of monuments, cleaning, straightening, fixing, that kind of thing. When the prisoners come out and work crews to a cemetery, it's really good for their morale. Coming outside is really special. And learning something, learning a skill is really good, and doing something meaningful. So it's really a very, very positive kind of program. And we haven't yet placed anyone, but we're looking forward to it. Um, Part of the problem is that it's hard to track folks when they get released. So what we're doing is proactively getting information of their next of kin so that we'll be able to reach them when they get out. So that's the Prince program. And we don't have a website, but now that you know about it, if you have questions, I'm certainly available to talk about that. Anybody want to hear more about Prince or questions about what we do? I'm glad to take questions right now. I already got the mail. It's on the kitchen table. Um, so, um, um, So now I want to talk to you about cemetery legislation, if that's okay. Okay. Recently, at some of the cemeteries in Maryland, there have been issues of, I don't want to call it desecration, but there's been conflict between a developer who was next door and the people who were taking care of the cemetery and an absentee owner. The particular cemetery I'm talking about is Rosa Bonheur in Howard County. This is started out as a pet cemetery, but it was unique because it was a cemetery where the pet owners could be buried next to their pets. So it had human burials and pet burials. And there are probably thousands of pet burials. There's probably only 30 or 40 human burials. But the developer next door wanted to grab the cemetery and develop it. I worked with a team of people who were caring for the cemetery, cutting the grass, etc. And we negotiated with the developer for a few years and failed. The developer wouldn't give up on what they wanted to do, and we weren't willing to compromise and sell a third of the cemetery to him. Not that we owned it, but it was an interesting discussion. Then one day, actually, it was a year ago, right before Christmas, that we discovered that there had been bodies disinterred, dug up, and apparently reburied at the back of the cemetery. We think so that the developer could expand the road at the front of the cemetery. And once the human bodies were out of the way, then it would just be pets in the way, and he would just be able to, you know, bulldoze right through that area. And as a result of that, and other kinds of issues where folks whose relatives were buried in cemeteries, as a result of that kind of thing, a group of people started working on cemetery legislation for the coming legislative session, and we're working on 6 different areas. The first one is we're addressing the issue of abandoned and neglected cemeteries. Last year, there was a bill put in to set up a checkoff fund. You know, when you do your income taxes, you can check off if you want to make a donation to a particular fund. So that was proposed last year, but it didn't go through. But we're proposing it again this year, and instead of just abandoned cemeteries, we're adding neglected cemeteries. And one of the reasons for that is because the prison work crews can't come out and work at a cemetery that doesn't have an owner. And if the cemetery doesn't have an owner, it's technically abandoned. So to be able to utilize those prison crews, an owner has to be identified. So we're proposing that that fund be for both abandoned and neglected cemeteries. And the second companion piece to that is to set up a commission that would work on getting grant funds, funds from major donors, in-kind donations from different companies that work in this area to identify abandoned cemeteries around the state, come up with a database, and to help them uh, get back on their feet, so to speak, help them with maintenance issues, things like that. So that's the first 2 bills. The third one is to look at the way that disinterment approval happens in the state. In the state of Maryland, disinterment requests go to the state's attorney, and the state's attorney requires, well, the law requires that there's a certain amount of notice, one-time notice has to go into the paper, and that's pretty much it. And we just think that that's crazy. First of all, the state's attorney doesn't really care about this. They have enough other things to do. But also, there's no real notice given to the descendants, and they have no ability to, you know, intervene or object or anything like that. So we're proposing modifications to the way that the disinterment process happens. We're not talking about disinterment of one person to be buried with their family in another cemetery. We're talking about, you know, the situation where some developer wants to take out the first 2 rows of a cemetery so they can widen something, the road or something like that. We're also looking at the different ways that databases are maintained in the state. Right now, the responsibility for maintaining cemetery databases are divided between three different agencies: the State Highway Administration, the Maryland Historical Trust, and the Office of Cemetery Oversight. And we think that there needs to be coordination between the three groups and one unified database instead of three partial databases. Fourth one is to increase penalties for people who do bad things in cemeteries, not only vandalism, but who are doing, digging up bodies that they shouldn't be digging up, that kind of thing. And the last one is to look at the way that Maryland law governs cemetery sales. If someone wants to sell a cemetery, there's very few restrictions. A court may be involved, but we think that a sale of a cemetery needs to have a mechanism for making sure that descendants are involved in the process, given the opportunity to buy the cemetery or to find a nonprofit that can run the cemetery rather than building condos on a cemetery. So that's the legislation that we've been working on. And if you follow the legislative calendar, it's legislature in Maryland's just been starting in session. And for the next 3 months, things will be crazy over there in Annapolis. So that's a summary of what's happening with cemeteries. And I can go into more detail or depth in other aspects or more in those aspects. But I sort of want to hear what questions people have and what direction you'd like for me to go in, or what do you like me to talk about next?
David, could you say a little bit about who typically owns a cemetery? I guess I never thought about that those they had owners.
Sure. So religious organizations often own cemeteries. A church might have a graveyard right next to the church. But if the church goes out of business, right, or if the church, sells it to another church, right? So, for example, there's a Methodist church that went out of business and sold it to a new church, and the new church didn't have any, connection to the cemetery part, and the people who had relatives buried there did. But, the question is, who owns it? Who's going to take care of it? Sometimes, especially in the Washington area, there are large cemeteries that are owned by corporations. The corporation that owns more of them than any is the Service Corporation International, which is the largest cemetery and funeral home owner in the country. They have like 2,000 cemeteries and funeral homes that they own. And, they have different sections for different religions and different cultural groups in many of their cemeteries. They typically charge a little more than other cemeteries. So, the big challenge for cemeteries is how do you balance out how much you charge versus making sure you have enough money in your perpetual care fund to be able to maintain the cemetery. Because if you do your perpetual care fund analysis, you want to think about 100 years out. You want to make sure there's enough money for 100 years. Perpetual is a long time. 100 years is a long time, but that's typically the window. So the theory is that once the cemetery is full and there's no more income coming in for selling plots, you still want to have enough money to be able to maintain the cemetery. So that's a little bit.
I was wondering about, I went to visit Leesburg, Virginia, and came across just on the side of the road a marker that said this was a burial ground for enslaved persons. And someone had taken over the care and the markings. It actually was on the news, I think, because they buried, there was a current burial done there.
Mhm.
And I was wondering in Maryland if you've come across any, signs, markers, or anything either in or near cemeteries that say they are for, previously enslaved people.
Okay, that's a great question. So you're familiar with the Underground Railroad and which went through major parts of Maryland. And newly freed people formed congregations, they formed cemeteries. And so this is prevalent, especially on certain parts of the Eastern Shore or Southern Anne Arundel County. But it's interesting because the Prince Project, the one where we bring out work crews from the prison, we've almost every cemetery we've worked in so far has been an African American cemetery, and almost all of them go back to the 1860s. So, some of them claim that Harriet Tubman stayed there overnight or something like that. But it's really fascinating history. One of the interesting parts about that is that when people are poor, they can't afford fancy tombstones. So sometimes tombstones will be made out of concrete, right? Not granite. Sometimes they'll be made out of wood and they'll deteriorate more quickly. And you may not see any sign of a tombstone at all, but you may notice other things. You may notice indentations in the ground. And you can discover where burials are sometimes with ground penetrating radar. So in Howard County, again, I happen to live in Howard County, so I know more about this from here. There was a cemetery called there was a Catholic seminary called St. Mary's Seminary, which had a white cemetery with upright monuments and an enslaved cemetery with no monuments that were discernible. And when it was sold, a developer was putting up housing and did not, apparently, there was no recordation of the enslaved part of the cemetery, and they started hitting human bones. And they stopped the construction, and that led to legislation to identify where all the cemeteries were in the county and, strict rules about how things were handled from there on. But so that it's a good question. I think that it's going to be easy to find many cemeteries, African American cemeteries, cemeteries with people who were slaves or who were formerly slaves or were freed throughout Maryland, that they're going to be prevalent.
Thank you.
Okay, so Kim had something in the chat and I didn't catch it. Can we? Have you noticed any ongoing connection between prison workers and the cemeteries and the land where they work? So because the Prince Projects work mostly with African American cemeteries, and because the prisoners are almost always 100% African American, they are very interested in the cemeteries from a genealogy perspective, from this is the kind of thing that's more meaningful than picking up trash on the side of the road. I think that it changes their approach to how they work in a cemetery because they care more about what they're doing because they connect to the people who are buried there. I think did I answer your question right, Kim? Did I get the point here?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, good. All right. Pat says, why did cemeteries evolve from family plots to church managed to sprawling parks? That's a good question. I think that I'm going to make some guesses here, and you can sort of say, well, that doesn't sound right. I think that when life is more rural, there's more of a family plot kind of situation. So, for example, there are in Howard County again, there's a place called Belmont, right, which was served as a retreat center, but going way back, it was a family-owned estate, and it has a cemetery that has maybe 20 or 30 burials in it because it was just for the people who lived and worked there. Um, when did church managed um, graveyards start? I don't know the answer to that, but I think that they've probably been around just as long as family plots. I think people who especially did not own their own land, felt connected to their church and would like to be buried in the church slot. Sprawling parks is another question. The whole idea of um, lawns with beautiful um, landscaping and nice neat rows and things like that. That's a more modern invention. I don't know who invented it, but it caught on pretty quick and it's fairly ubiquitous around the country. One of the interesting things that's different in the United States than other countries is that when someone buys a burial plot, it's usually forever. In other countries, you don't buy a burial plot, you may rent it for a certain amount of time. And after the certain amount of time, you can renew it or they take it back from you and may do another burial in it. So that didn't really answer your question directly. I'll have to do a little more research to be able to tell you when these sprawling cemetery parks began.
A lot of them got going with the whole what's referred to as the rural garden concept, which is Victorian. And in Baltimore, I think Greenmount is probably the apex of that. And that opened in 1839. It was a former estate outside the city. Now, of course, it's not outside the city, but with the churchyards that were within the original precincts of Baltimore, they had run out of space for burials by 1830, and the city was expanding and development wanted to expand with it. And there was also the whole health hazard of you had this sort of fetid yard full of decomposition. So lots of people formed tiny corporations and bought what were then open fields, Baltimore Cemetery, Greenmount, Loudon Park, and New Cathedral is called that because to distinguish it from its original place in well, it was West Baltimore. I can't remember where now, but sort of in the what's now Ashburton area. And so they bought, this 600 acres or something, which is now New Cathedral. And most of the original burials were dug up and taken out to Catonsville to the new cemetery. I can tell you that much.
Well, that's pretty good. Thank you. I think that you find this also in other cities. The old estate that was, became what is now the historic. Um, let's take the tour through the cemetery. So I think that history that you do is really good. And I have to say I've done a little too much with New Cathedral because New Cathedral owns the St. Peter's Cemetery. Well, I should say the Catholic Archdiocese owns both New Cathedral and the St. Peter's Cemetery in West Baltimore. And St. Peter's Cemetery is the most recent place where the work crews came out from the Prince Project. And we were out there for 2 weeks and there were parts of that cemetery that hadn't been touched, we think, in about 18 years. Um, it was like not only a forest, but it was a forest where vines as thick as my arm were wrapped around trees. And, you know, um, people said, "So what did you do?" And my response is, "Well, we taught the prisoners how to use chainsaws."
I was going to say kudzu and chainsaws. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, we started out with hand saws, but we were making no progress. And um, people say you can't let prisoners use chainsaws, and we're going, they're going to be in your community in a year, so they might as well have an employable skill, you know. So they did a lot of cutting down of invasive species that had grown into trees, and honeysuckle especially was one of those, and the vines were just amazing, just amazing. Um, so yeah, so that was good history. Thank you. Other questions from folks? What would you like to learn? If I don't know the answer, someone else on the call probably does.
There's a question in the chat from Jean. Is there a database of family cemeteries in Maryland?
That's a great question. You may remember that I said at one point that there are 3 different state agencies responsible for keeping a database of cemeteries. State Highway Administration, because they want to know if they're going to expand and build a road, if they're going to be on top of a cemetery. There's the Maryland Historical Trust, which care about cemeteries that are historically old, and the Office of Cemetery Oversight, which is mandated to keep track of all cemeteries in the state, and none of them do it as well as they should. And so that's why we're suggesting in a bill that they begin to work together and not just name the cemetery, but not just give an address. Sometimes the address of a cemetery is not that helpful. But if you give GPS coordinates, that can help a lot. And we think it also should include the condition of the cemetery, how big it is, how many stones are in it, and what's the oldest tombstone, who the owner is. There should be information. So some counties do that. Some counties are very good at doing an inventory, but there is no comprehensive inventory at the state level that is really accurate. Family cemeteries are a subset of that, and between family and religious cemeteries, they probably comprise the bulk of the cemeteries in the state, but not necessarily the ones where there's the most number of burials. So, Jean, did that answer some of your question?
Well, the reason I asked the question, I had worked for the city of Baltimore for 30 years, and I was their watershed manager in charge of Loch Raven, Liberty, and Pretty Boy watersheds. And there were at least 4 family cemeteries that I was aware of that were either on or were surrounded by watershed property, which my recollection is they weren't turned over to the city, but they were still family owned. 2 of the 4, now I've been retired since 2011, but 2 of the 4 were maintained on a regular basis by outside groups. I don't know at this point who was doing that back then, but there were 2. One was very small, maybe like 8, 10 grave sites that we didn't even find out about until I had been there maybe 28 years. And one of my employees came across it out in the woods. So something like that. And then there's 2 at Loch Raven, 1 at Liberty, and I believe the 4th one was at Pretty Boy. But one of the ones at Loch Raven is a very well-known Baltimore County name. And we tried to do renovation work there back, again, this goes back 15, 17, 18 years, resetting the gravestones and doing, cleaning up the area. It's back in the woods. We tried to see if any family heirs were interested in helping out and doing any work there, and we hit a dead end with that. But it's still there, and I often think of that cemetery and would love it to be, brought back to what it was. But
Can the public access it?
yeah, I mean, if you know where it is,
Mhm,
you can.
mhm. So that's not that uncommon. I'll tell you a story about the BWI airport. when Baltimore City, I believe, was taking the land for the airport, there were, I believe, about 30 cemeteries that were in that land that they were taking. And they negotiated with them, and many of them disinterred folks and then reburied them elsewhere. But there was one cemetery where they refused to do it, basically, and they had the big court fight. And if you read the court transcript, you learn a lot about what was going on. That cemetery is still there. It's in the middle of the airport. Most people have no idea that it's there. It's about 100 feet from a runway. Um, when you when you go to the cemetery, there's a big gate with no lock, and then there's a smaller gate with no lock. So you can walk right in. The security people may come by and wave hello. Um, at least that's what they did when I was there. And it's a beautiful cemetery. It's got like hundreds of burials in it. Um, they there's still apparently people who own plots there who are still buried, but not a lot. And it's somebody's maintaining it. I'm not sure who, but it's right inside the airport. It's right next to the runway. It's near where the fire department has some of their emergency vehicles if something happens with a plane. Um, so this is not so unusual to have cemeteries sort of popping up in places where you don't expect them to be. And there needs to be a way for an organized way to take care of them and make sure that they don't get damaged.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Jean, with the cemetery that is in the Loch Raven watershed area, you said you just hit a dead end. Was it that you couldn't find descendants or that you did, but they weren't interested?
Well, we found many descendants
But they were not interested.
and they weren't interested now. No.
That's always too bad because people are probably saying to themselves, well, if I expressed interest, they're going to want me to pay for it, right? To pay for the maintenance, right? That's going to be the first reaction. And, there is a need for someone to cover the cost and and the municipality or the county doesn't always want to pick that up and do it themselves. So there's some abandoned and neglected cemeteries need a good solution. We don't have a good solution yet. Other questions or comments?
I just it reminded me of a conversation I had. I met a woman who was from Uzbekistan, and she said she was going back. She sends money to a friend who still lives in Uzbekistan to take care of the cemetery, her
Mhm.
family graves. And I had never thought about that. I'd never, encountered that before, but you're right. Somebody's got to pay for it.
Yeah, I mean, there probably are solutions to that. I mean, one of the solutions might be, don't plant things that keep on growing. Um, you know, there's at one point I read about some kind of special grass that grew 2 inches and then stopped growing, and it never grew more than that, right? So you would never have to cut the grass. Certainly in places like Arizona or things like that, they don't plant grass. It's like a desert, and they have sand and rocks, and so maintenance is a lot easier. As soon as you plant trees or even bushes that turn into trees, you're already in a different category. So we need to also be smart about how we do things in cemeteries.
Part of me thinks trees would be a good idea, at least in urban areas, because you'd probably attract more walkers and visitors, thus elevating awareness. And it would be birds, and it would help things not be 407 degrees all summer, things of that nature. I mean, let's take Baltimore Cemetery. Has anybody been there? Baltimore Cemetery is at the eastern terminus of North Avenue, and it's got to be 70 acres. It's a giant rectangle, and the graves are laid out kind of like in rows. It's obvious that Baltimore Cemetery is very low on funds. They do the very best they can, but a lot of the markers are gone or toppled, but the grass gets mowed, and you know, it's kind of shabby in there, but they do a valiant job. But there's no trees, and so visually it's kind of grim. And every time I go there looking for somebody, because I do a lot of genealogy work, I think, you could partner with Tree Baltimore or something like that. But I know that's a whole different discussion.
Yeah, well, trees have pros and cons,
Yes,
right? That you shouldn't plant trees when you're still doing burials, because if you do a burial and you might need to smash the tree roots to do the grave, right? So for sure you shouldn't plant a tree until all the burials in that area are done, right? Um, Second of all, the tree roots will, they're relentless. They will,
yes.
um, knock down tombstones, make them unreadable. They'll wind around them. They'll do interesting things. So you have to be smart about what kind of trees you're planting, where you're planting them. I think the concept of trees is a great concept, but the implementation has to be done really well. And then when you do plant trees, you have to be ready to maintain them, even if you don't do much, you know, pieces of wood fall down, leaves fall. So there's always additional maintenance for trees. I mean, I like trees. I think they're a great thing, but and you pointed out some of their important features. It's nice to go to a cemetery where there's shade, um, you know. Um, so there's some trade-offs and there's some considerations.
Yeah, lots of cemeteries that are treed. When I'm there, there's inevitably at least two or three people bird watching. There's a little, bird nerd with binoculars having like a great day
Uh-huh.
because, you
Mhm.
know, he pretty much has the place to himself except for me. So that was what really got me thinking about it.
Right. So cemetery should probably put out a little container at the front saying, if you're visiting our cemetery, please put in $1, right? It'll help us
Yeah,
with
I think
maintenance,
that would be a good idea.
Yeah. And, shouldn't be like someone standing there insisting, and it shouldn't be like some outrageous request, but, a small amount will help them do maintenance, and that's going to be important in the long run. So it's
Well, they
always good.
charge you to look up stuff in the office, so why not charge you to stroll the grounds?
Well, they shouldn't charge you to look up stuff. That's crazy. Um, but each cemetery does their own thing. They set their own rules. So yeah, I'm open for other questions or comments, or some of the experts on here are also open for questions or comments. Did anybody get what they wanted? Did you get answers, or did you find out information that you were looking for when you came here?
I did.
Okay, good.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Okay, good, good. Other folks we haven't heard from, do you want to say anything? I could call your names, but I don't want to embarrass you.
Are you ever looking for volunteers to come help with machetes?
Well, it's interesting. The Coalition to Protect Maryland Burial Sites, which is a nonprofit statewide organization, does twice a year cleanup days where they pick a cemetery and then they all come out and do a cleanup together. It's not prisoners, which is okay. Um, and they use all kinds of tools, machetes included. Um, So the prisoner crews that come out were pretty limited by the rules from the Department of Corrections. They won't let us have regular people out there like us, regular people, right? Out there with the prisoners, with the work crews. Um, I mean, I've been out there with them, and these folks are none of them are in prison for violent offenses or anything like that, and they're the nicest people in the world. Um, but the rules are that, you know, we can't we can't work in cemeteries near schools. We can't work in cemeteries near playgrounds. We can't, you know, and we can't have other folks out there with the prisoner crews. But if you're interested in doing cemetery work, get in touch with the Coalition to Protect Maryland Burial Sites. It's a wonderful organization, and you know they have their regular cleanups, and you'll be able to jump right in and learn a lot about cemeteries.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
What should we do to support the bills that are currently facing the legislature?
Well, we would love to have people testify about our bills, and we're waiting to get them back from bill drafting. And once we do, I'm happy to share them with you. And if folks want to testify, we're glad to have you do that. That would be super.
That would be good. I would like to know about that.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. We're still sort of in the middle of the process. It's a very interesting process. You know, you get sponsors and you say, here's the bill we'd like to see, and then it goes into bill drafting, and then it comes back with questions, and then you respond to the questions, and then the sponsors go, but wait a second, I want to do such and such, you know. So um, it, if you haven't done this before, which I haven't, it's an interesting challenge. But we would be glad to have folks help us out, and we'd be glad to share our bills with you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you. That was very interesting.
Well, my pleasure, and thanks for inviting me. And you know, maybe I'll see you out at the next cemetery cleanup.
Thanks
I'm
for the
machete.
talk, David.
Yeah, machetes are good.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. David, I just want to say you have a really just easygoing way of connecting with people and just a very calm demeanor. And it was just a pleasure to listen to you, and your knowledge just is really valuable. So thanks for taking the time to do this. It was really nice.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, and um, I love the fact that you have your society right near my friend's house. So when I come to see you, I can go see my friend too.
Oh, nice. Yeah, come on back. We're here, as you know, like Wednesdays and Thursdays and the first Sunday of every month. So stop by and visit us.
Great.
Thanks,
Great.
everyone. Last call for questions, comments. It seems like things are wrapping up here, and it's just about 8. So
Okay, good.
set you all free. David Zinner, everyone. Thanks so much. See you next time.
Nice to
Thanks,
see everybody.
bye.
Take care.